That's just easy going.
Yeah.
So, real quick check. Who here is kind of about history? It's not your favorite thing. If you could skip it, you would. All right. Who here loves history? Fanatical about history. All right.
I would kind of in the middle of those.
Middle. Okay, so you kind of.
Yeah.
So, is there any kinds of history that you enjoy?
I like the history that, I guess all history founds things, but I like the history behind. History is behind everything today, but I like the history behind things that you can see evident in the modern day, and you can look back on how those things started and were created.
Yeah.
I like all history though. I like looking at a lot of ancient history. I always liked ancient Egyptian history, and back in that time period was always fascinating to me. But
What's the most significant thing from ancient Egyptian history that stands out to you?
just some of the culture things they did, and a lot of how creative they were with things they built and constructed, especially like with the pyramids, Giza. Those always were interesting to me,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of theories behind those. Even some theories behind like things that were said in the Bible about even those being like heavenly beings, helping those be created because of how strategically they were made. But yeah, just a lot of different things fascinated me about those that time period and place.
Cool. But you, Noah?
Can't say I don't know if I have a favorite time period or not from history, but I do also, kind of like Elijah was saying, I do like to take a bit of a sociological approach to history and seeing how the influence of culture, as you had emphasized in the beginning, is involved in a certain time, even as it relates to today, and seeing how things are today because of past events, like we're going to be looking at the Constitution, seeing how that plays out and impacts the current state of things in America. But yeah, I do like to see themes that, like general themes that play through even a very expansive amount of time, like seeing the ideas that move from something as early as ancient Egypt to Greek culture to Roman culture to the British Empire to America. It's just there are themes that connect through all of those times throughout millennia. So yeah, I can't say I'm a huge fan of like being able to memorize and spell out facts and dates and stuff, but I do like I guess what could be termed historical theory. Just seeing how events connect and seeing it as it is a great story, one great story. So in that sense, seeing the purpose of God underlying the events in history too is, I think, not only a super interesting way to approach history, but also a necessary one in some ways. So, yeah.
Oh, okay, so what was on the box?
Good. You want to share?
Sure. I haven't done like a large amount of history in my life, so it's not like I'm not too educated on like a bunch of different stuff in history. But one thing I did enjoy, I think a couple years ago, was studying on a certain person, which was a poet. Her name is Emily Dickinson. And I guess you could say that's history because it's about her life, but I enjoyed learning about her life and the way she wrote poems and just different stuff about like her life and the backstory and stuff. So I am excited to be able to learn more about history and do it more often, and just the way to learn it and take it in. So
yeah. Well, and that's a really good point, because biography is so critical to history. In fact, you can't really have history without biography. Right. And ultimately, I know it's a little cliche, but history is God's story, his story, right? But it's his story in the lives of individual people. Right. Individual people create culture. Culture shapes nations, movements, historical seasons, times, and so we react now to a lot of what has happened in the past. That's good.
Yeah, I don't think I have like a particular favorite subject in history, but I do like the foundation of kind of like the United States and just seeing how it's evolved and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like what I like in history. So.
Awesome.
I don't have anything that I really don't like or do like. It's my favorite. I just like all of it, pretty much.
Okay, sounds good. So I know you guys have been going over some early American history and the Revolution and that sort of thing, and so today we'll read just through the preamble of the Constitution in a minute, but we're going to ask ourselves the question, why? Why was the Constitution framed? Why did it come to pass? Why is it significant in the course of all human history? The Constitution and really ultimately the Revolutionary period in America is reflected upon by many historians to be a huge pivotal shift in the culture of the world. Now, part of that is because Americans tend to be a little bit narcissistic and we think everything revolves around us, but there are some really good values that are coming out of what happened and how really the Revolutionary War, the Revolutionary time was countercultural. America went against a lot of what was established before. It borrowed and adopted certain things, but we go from a more feudal system, right, with kings and peasants, to now a government of people as co-equals, co-laborers, and so we get a lot of biblical imagery and cultural stuff that are built upon principles that have been passed down from Greeks, Romans, Egyptians. It all has that lineage tracing back. And so the first question I want to discuss, and it's open to anyone who has some thoughts on it, is why was the Constitution written? Who knows the Constitution? Who knows what it entails?
Was it written for like a combination of different laws, or
Yeah, so we look at the Constitution. It's a precursor to the Bill of Rights. And so we know that the Bill of Rights set apart very specific rights that we have, right? Like very certain ones. But so we're not getting too far into the laws yet, although the Bill of Rights can be rightly considered a continuation of the Constitution. Constitution, now taking a step back, kind of frames out ultimately how do we operate, how do we run. It's really the foundation of our government, and what is the process, how do we elect officials, who's in charge of what, and how does that look like. But even deeper than the technical parts are, and my hope is we can discuss this today, is what is at the heart of it? What is the real value of it? Because obviously as you're studying, I hope you've studied things like the coercive acts, also called the intolerable acts. You've probably studied a little bit about like the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, and all of these things in revolutionary times that the colonists are starting to push back against Great Britain, correct? Why did they push back so adamantly? Because we're talking about really full-on rebellion against the king, which was tantamount to mutiny in those times. That was like a great sin, is to object to the king, right? Throughout history we see that. So why were the American colonists so adamant about doing their own thing with government?
Because they didn't want there to be the same kind of rule that there had been with a king. And that's why the Constitution was written, right? So there'd be a different way of ruling than throughout history. It had just been one ruler or dictator or just certain high people, and not the opinion of all the people.
Right. Yeah, we have a system where the king rules absolutely, and laws are mandated by the king, now to a position where people are in consistent agreement over the laws of the land. What are some of the positives of that system changing?
More opinionated of more people, not just one.
Yeah, more thought is given. Has anybody ever been around somebody who controls the decisions? And if you're with that certain person, they're always doing what they want, and you kind of have to go along with it. Is that always a good thing? I know you guys have parents, so right. That's part of the job as a parent, right? Is to direct and guide. That can be it can be a really good thing, because hopefully the people who are in charge are leading you because they care about you. But the problem is what? The king, did he care about the commoners much? In American history, did he care about the colonies? No. This is why we had the Declaration of Independence, right? The tyrant King George were rebelling against his unfair acts, right? Taxation without representation. That was a big part of it. You guys talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, all right, each of you give me $10 tax. Right? No, right now. Well, no, you're not gonna just do that, right? And so the colonists are wanting to do something different, yeah, as a collective group. So what are some other thoughts on why we have the Constitution?
These questions are tying pretty much directly back to the stuff we've been studying the last few weeks. So I guess just kind of review, if you can,
Yeah.
what we've just been recently looking at.
And there's no right or wrong answers. This is why we have debate and discussion. Yeah. We can have disagreements and we can wrestle with it. There's plenty of historians that would disagree with what even we're talking about right now. Plenty of historians. In fact, there's many historians that think the American Revolution was one of the worst things that ever happened in history. History is open for discussion. It's not absolute, always. See, you guys are shy. All right, let's take another look at with something, and maybe we'll tie this back in. So let's talk about our current culture. Anybody follow politics or America, the condition of America right now? Would you say that America as a purely political movement, it is in a really good place? Why not? What's the problems with our current system?
I feel like there's too many rights. Everyone just gets to do what they want, and it's just not really that good
much
for
order.
everyone.
Good. Yeah, not much order, too many rights. So why is that specifically? Why is too many rights an unhealthy thing?
Because everyone gets to do what they want, and like, it's just not good for the people.
Yeah, that's excellent insight. In fact, the Constitution covers some of that, because what we get away with from history, American history anyways, is that we've kind of twisted it in a lot of ways. We talk about in early American history that we all have certain inalienable rights, right? There's certain specific rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of Cheetos. What's it again? Pursuit of happiness.
Come on.
You guys can do this. I know it's only the first week, but we'll get there.
We're gonna memorize the preamble together.
Yeah, I'm gonna make Noah give you a test. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the problem that most people interpret wrong about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is that America was founded to give us all of these rights. No, the Constitution was actually framed to protect very specific rights. It wasn't to expand it. It wasn't to give us, when we think about freedom, and I think this is what you're talking about. When we're talking about freedom, freedom doesn't mean I get to do whatever I want whenever I want. That's not real freedom, right? That's idolatry. American culture has become very idolatrous. Yeah, we worship at the altar of, if it feels good, I can do it. If I think it's right, it's right. Yeah, so that's really insightful. It's one of the reasons, really important reasons, why it's so important that we understand the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and what we were founded on. Because ultimately, my opinion, these things point us back to Christ. because America was intended to be founded upon religious freedoms. In fact, when we look at all of the flawed men, and there were many flaws with them, who helped write the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution, many of them, most of them in fact, pointed towards God, the divine, as being the influence for what they wrote. Any other thoughts on our culture today and why America's probably not in a real good place?
Humans.
Right. So, meaning what? Go into that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, explain that to me.
Well, it's either you're following the Lord or you're not. And when you're not, which most of the world is not, everything goes the opposite way of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Good. So a lack of discipline, a lack of commitment to a set of principles, ideals, right? And our tendency is the old nature, right? To go back to things that are unhealthy, things that are easy. I mean, is there anyone here who really loves to take on really hard challenges all the time? Or do you guys find your natural tendency is to want to take the easy way? Yeah, like when somebody's sitting in front of a room and asking you questions and you don't want to answer them. You just want to stay quiet. Is this hour over yet? Oh my gosh, it's only 11:17. We got 45 more minutes of this. Right? Our tendency is to kick out of what is difficult, the discipline, the obedience, those things. Culturally, yeah, humanity is a big problem. Humans get in the way. Other thoughts?
Well, yeah, just like you were saying, that's why everything's kind of come to where it is in our country, because everyone wants the easy way out of everything. Mm-hmm. And there's no discipline or anything for what they have done. So there's being given a free way to do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And it's just gotten worse.
Yes, indeed. We interpret things through our own lens, do we not? So the Constitution becomes a document that is written for us, how we see it, instead of a document that is written for the masses and written with a very specific purpose in mind and end goal in mind. And so it's important, again, why do we study history? Because you're living in it. Your lives are biographies. Your life is a history. I would imagine if you told the story of your lives, we would find probably some really good things that you guys have said or done or thought or felt, and probably some pretty bad things too, if you were really honest about it. And the question is as you've gone through the ebbs and flows of your life, what has been the things that have changed you, made you decide who you are, what you like? Did anyone like certain things when you were a kid and now you just kind of laugh at yourself and think, oh man, what was I doing back then? You changed, right? Why did you change? What are some of the reasons? Did you have siblings that hassled you for liking that and so it was embarrassing and so you just stopped doing it? Did you just mature and grow out of it and we don't like those things anymore?
Well, even the world around us changes too, so our interests could change.
Yeah. So you adjust to the changes of the world culturally, right? We all have little mini computers that we carry around with us that even 20 years ago, that was not a normal course of life. You have access to information that back in my day, when we were, the olden days, it was paper and pencil. There was no computers at school. We had floppy disks. If you had a computer, big old, and they would be green screens with little dots on there. All right, and so yeah, as culture changes, as our world changes around us, it influences the way that we dress, the way that we talk, all of those things. We are impacted by history. Is that always a good thing? No, probably not. Likely, us having access to cell phones all the time, probably not a good thing. But if we're lost in the woods and we have reception, might be a really good thing to have with us, right? So history is evolving. And so yeah, so any other thoughts on current American political systems, where we're at? let's go back then. Why is the Constitution important? Why are your parents' rules for you important? Why is God's mandates and rules to you important?
Because it guides you through life.
The Constitution is meant to be a guide. A specific direction that was with a specific purpose that was intended to get to a very specific outcome, right? God's heart for you is a very specific purpose for all his children, all his sons, right? But individually, each one of us, God has a very distinct, specific purpose. We use the guidepost of that is the Bible. That gives us the foundation on which the Father builds his precepts, his purposes, his culture. Now what happens if one of us misinterprets that? Or we look at the Bible through our own lens? Are we then guided by the principles, or are we guided by self? We're guided by self. And that's not a good thing. Okay, so it's a guide. What else could it be likened to?
Kind of something to live life by, in the sense of being a citizen of the United States.
Yeah, it's a measuring post, right? We can measure ourselves against something concrete. It's not something abstract. We have something very clear in our minds that we measure ourselves to. And so are we following that pattern of life that is prescribed for us, or are we not? It's easy then to look at that and say, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. Again, getting back to understanding the truth of God's word, right? Anyone else besides me look at the Bible sometimes and go, I'm not walking that out as I should. Or the Spirit of God falls upon you and you go, oh, right? And so, yeah, it's a measuring device, which doesn't just measure us as individuals, but it measures us against a culture. We talked about this, right? The problem with America right now is there's way too much individualism, rugged individualism, instead of an idea that are centered around this collective thought of a group of people that are advancing the cause of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Not the guarantee of happiness, but the pursuit of it, that we have every opportunity to find happiness in our lives. Good. Any other thoughts on that?
Is it like a foundation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, stabilizing, right? Because ultimately, if we don't have that, if there's no foundation for culture, then there is no culture, right? Because culture must be established. It must be clearly laid out. And that foundation doesn't really change much. Now we'll see in American history, right? There's different articles, things that can be added, and there's ways to go about adding foundational laws or rules. They're very, very difficult to establish new change to foundational understandings. It's very difficult to do that. And there's a reason for that. But yeah, it provides, ultimately, foundation provides safety. If we don't have the safety of the foundation of what is written, if we don't have an understanding and an agreement upon that, then the whole house will crumble, right? It's the choice between building on the rock or building on the sand. If we all have our own opinions and our own thoughts and we all apply it differently, what is going to happen to the house? It's going to fall. Abraham Lincoln borrows that when he's talking about in the Civil War. He borrows biblical language to say, a house divided against itself will not stand. And so we see throughout American history there's these seasons and times where had both sides of the conversation or dialogue get back to why was the Constitution written? Why was it established? We would probably have avoided civil wars, lots of problems between states, certainly problems between different races and creeds and colors of people, men and women's suffrage. All of that stuff would have ultimately resolved itself. But because people forgot, historically, the values of the Constitution, and I'm just going to be honest, like, how many of you know the Constitution, right? Like, when we ask that question, everyone's like, ooh. So either you were afraid that you might get it wrong, at which case it's much better to venture out and get it wrong than to stay silent on, or we just don't know, and that's okay. But as we enter into, adulthood, if we're going to live in this country, it would be really important to at least have a basic understanding of why do we have the laws written that we do, because my generation has not done a very good job of passing on to you, culturally speaking, a really good condition to live in. You live in some of the most divisive times in American history, which is hard to say when we literally fought a war against one another. You live in much more divisive times. Why? Because you got access to information, opinions. And if we don't root it back in, ultimately, in cultural understanding together, then we're going to fall vastly short of ultimately the great ideal of America. Life, it's a good thing to pursue. True living. Not just, do I have a pulse? But are you really living? Liberty, real freedom. Real freedom from the understanding of the founders of and framers of the Constitution was not, I get to do whatever I want. It was the freedom to empower culturally people around us to have the same goal in mind. And real freedom doesn't mean I get what I want, but it means what is for the betterment of this group of people, and then the pursuit of happiness. So ultimately our aim is to what? To have people be happy in the lifestyles that they have. We want there to be happiness, but that happiness doesn't come at the expense of the liberty and the life that is required to undergird that. And so those three principles are spelled out for us in the Constitution. So why was the Constitution here? Yes, everything you guys said is exactly right. And again, and I'm going to probably rehash this again and again and again to get it stuck in your head. It's so important that we understand that part of history. Why? Because you are living in it. And if you forget it, what's going to happen? When you have kids, you'll be the old guy sitting at a table talking about how your generation missed its opportunity to shift things. Now, ultimately, there's things that go far beyond, obviously, America, right? So I'm not trying to give you the sales pitch of you got to save America. We're talking about redemption, ultimately, and living out the American ideal, which I believe is truly a Christian ideal. And so the Constitution was written to provide safety and structure, to go against our base nature, which is to be selfish. It was to establish a few things. From a technical standpoint, the Constitution was written because before the Constitution, we had a thing called the Articles of Confederation. Did you guys talk about that at all? Who remembers, what were the Articles of Confederation?
Wasn't it like a set of rules to kind of bring the states together a little bit?
Yeah.
Because they were kind of all separated.
Exactly right. It was the first kind of attempt at ratifying an idea of a United States, right? The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. And so that was the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation had one major weakness, which was, sorry, I'm old, I forget things really easy. You're going to have to help me out here. Okay, so again, object lesson here, and I just want to take a moment to point it out. And this is not a criticism, so hear me. Those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. Why is history important? Why are things like understanding the Articles of Confederation and what happened important? Why is that kind of more than rote memory of what it is, the principles behind it? Because you guys are responsible to live your life, to try and freedom, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And that has to be based off of, right, information that we have culturally, sociologically. Articles of Confederation's major weakness was it did not allow for a strong central government. Why is that important? Because we have independent states, individuals, right? And what Georgia wanted, New York didn't. What Pennsylvania was fighting so diligently for, Virginia was having none of it. And so what's the problem if we don't have a mediator in between all of those things? What happens? You guys all have siblings. What happens when everyone wants something different? Is that a good form of government? Who usually wins? The strongest? The one with the loudest voice? The one who throws themselves on the floor and cries the loudest? Who wins those? Who wins the family arguments? Well, it kind of depends on the situation, right? But isn't it nice to sometimes have a mediator, somebody that you can go to say, okay, Noah just bit me again. I would like some resolution here. Without a strong central government, what would happen? The states would begin to pull away from one another, right? Because all of a sudden, you see states, and this is a big part of why we even had the Civil War, but you see in the South, which were really agrarian, meaning they had all the farms and all of those things, that lifestyle is radically different, correct? In the North, there was a lot more industry and things like that. That lifestyle is radically different, right? Like when you guys moved from Texas to California, was there a culture shift at all? When you guys moved up here from California, was there a culture shift at all? Right, different places, different upbringings, different belief systems, belief structures pull us in different ways. And so without the Constitution, which its intention was to clarify really for us the purposes of a central government. How do we have these independent states that have all of these rights within the states, but how do we make them unite together? Because there has to be one central government. We talked, I think you had said this, Esther, a little bit. One of the problems that we see today is there's all of these rights that are given. That's the negative of having a central government. When a central government becomes bigger than the states, which it wasn't intended to, then we're giving away all of these rights. What does it do? It lessens our ability to truly live. It certainly impacts your ability to have liberty, right? So if I made Elijah in charge of all of you, and you guys had to answer to him, because Elijah was the man. He was big government. That would infringe upon some things, right? What would be your first act to rule over your siblings? What would you mandate?
I don't know. Honestly.
You act like you haven't thought about this 1,000 times.
Honestly, I never have thought about that.
All right, Naomi, you're the benevolent ruler, big government. What would you? I mean, if you had the ability to do it, and you guys weren't nice, and you weren't, kind, you weren't taught the way that you were taught. Let's think about maybe somebody whose hearts don't wrap around the Lord and aren't trying to pursue things that are good and healthy. What would those tendencies be? Well, the big government, if we're not careful, goes back to the same thing we were trying to break away from Britain from. All of a sudden we have a king. Culturally speaking, now we have the presidency that becomes idolized beyond measure. We have presidents that just sign rules apart from the laws that are laid down in the Constitution. Yeah, we have all of these, again, arguments that are shifting our culture back towards what? Towards selfishness, self-serving, and then having one specific group of people that rule. It's called an oligarchy. All the rich have the power. And so, yeah, the first part of the Constitution that was really critical was to establish a central government, but was also to limit a central government. Because we need to have leadership. Anything that's healthy has leadership, right? And with leadership means that there must have submission. There must be submission to that leadership. But the beauty of America was that we framed out in the Constitution a choice of who leads us. Now, even in America, before the Constitution was written, we had delegates that were sent by their states. The founders of the Declaration of Independence, the founders of American history, those were all people who had land, who were rich. There wasn't any poor people that were sent right? Thomas Jefferson, rich. George Washington, rich. Benjamin Franklin, rich. Monroe, Adams, rich. But they were wrapped around this idea of community and culture, which expanded out, right? They weren't there to serve their own purpose. And so I'll just read through this real quick. Am I boring anyone yet? Sorry, I'm enjoying this because I love history.
I'm enjoying it.
All right, so this is we're going to talk about the preamble, and this is going to give us very, very specific things as to why, very specifically, why was this written. And so, again, we have to understand the Constitution on the heels of the Articles of Confederation. That they saw that things weren't working out. And to their credit, they didn't say, well, we gave it a good shot. And they said, no, let's go back to the drawing board here. And so this is the preamble. We, the people of the United States. And we'll stop there because, we might as well stop just a few words into the whole preamble. This was radically different than most other documents. What is the first word that it says there? We. The whole foundation of culture, as it pertains to the Constitution, is based on the idea of we. You and I. All of us together. Now this goes back to the Declaration of Independence, where it says that we're all created, right? All men, all women, we're all equals. And it's important that we understand that, particularly in the context of world history, because American Revolutionary history is one of the defining historical documents that encapsulates all people. The intention from the beginning was that all men were created equal. Not because any influential man said it, but because we were endowed with those gifts and graces by our Creator. So we, the people of what? The United States. And so again, it's not just us, but it's us collectively working towards this ideal. Right? So it's good to be individual. It's a much better thing to be an individual who's submitted to a group. That can be a bad thing, right? There's plenty of ideas where culture has broken down throughout American history. We see that currently. Gangs, drugs. There's the sins of our nation are many. Well, because we've lost sight of appropriate and healthy leadership. So we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. What does that mean? What do you think? A more perfect union.
One without defect.
Yeah? Why is it important to not have defect, or to move away from defect?
Because defect causes problems.
Yeah.
And that's what the Constitution was for, to eliminate the problems.
Let's look very specifically at the wording, because it doesn't say a perfect union. And this is an important distinction, and you'll find it particularly in any historical document that details matter. They say here, a more perfect. How is that different from perfect?
Getting better than what was.
Right.
Building on whatever.
Right. And so again, the idea of the Constitution is that it's a living document, that we should strive continually to do what? To try to have a more perfect union. It's ultimately using relational language here. Right? That the idea behind our Constitution is not one that's aiming for this perfect ideal, because quite honestly, the framers of the Constitution didn't have a clear picture of exactly what that looked like. Because they understood, when you look at their writings, that years down the line, cultures are going to shift. And the way that they had to write this, and this is what makes the document so amazing in so many ways, is they wrote with the foreknowledge of 200 years from now, there might be kids, young adults, hanging around a table with some old dude talking about history, and how that impacts them is going to be really important. So we have to write this in a way that's going to reflect upon them. In fact, Thomas Jefferson believed that the rules of the land, the Constitution, all of those things should change every 20 years. With each generation, they should write their own. Now, I'm thankful that as wise as he was, that they fought against that, because that would have created a bunch of instability. But here, it's in order to form what? A more perfect union. And so is the union perfect? No. Can it be? No. Can we always strive to be better? Yeah. You have every opportunity to do something that is good and right and noble, no matter how many times you've made a mistake. And I'm assuming some of you have made mistakes. Am I the only perfect one at the table? Me and Esther. Right, but when we make mistakes, right, we hopefully have conviction that leads us to change. Now, and again, I know you guys all have siblings, and I'm assuming there's sibling rivalries, sibling fights. Those dynamics happen. Do we ever regret those things? And so the goal would be to do what? To have a more perfect union. Not to promise perfection. I'll never do that again. Anyone ever? And then the next day?
Did he?
No, the goal is right, is to change. And so, and sorry, this is going to be going over this stuff again and again, because this will be the most critical part that we learn, is the preamble. All the technical stuff, super important, easy to look up on your phone. This is really the heart. If we do anything in the next 8 weeks or so, we want to understand the heart. We, for your generation, it's you. I mean, you really are the forebearers, right? You're the ones moving forward. When it comes to the younger ones in our midst, right? They'll certainly be looking to their parents and some of the older people, but who would they be most influenced by? Your generation. And so it's incumbent upon you, and we'll get into this, to set your hearts and minds towards, relationally speaking. Now we're going beyond the Constitution here, but this is why history is important. It is incumbent upon you to try to cultivate a more perfect union with the people around you. If our political parties of today would just read those first few sentences, we would stop yelling over one another and yelling at one another. Because hard as it is to believe, America was not founded on political party systems. There was no multiple political parties intended. But man, being man, got into certain camps where we established. Now there were different ideas and thoughts. There were certain groups, but there weren't like two parties that opposed one another. There was actually probably 4 or 5 originally of ways of thinking about framing things. So we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. So that's the next thing. So what do you think that means, establish justice?
Make justice.
To make justice. What would that look like in your mind? What is, when you think of justice, what is that? What do you think that is?
Well, it can be 2 things. As in, if you want a justice for something, is if someone did something wrong or bad to you and you wanted a justice for it, or you maybe have done something to either deserve justice in a good way or the other way around, that you need justice for something you have done that is not okay.
Good. Yeah. So really there's 2 ideas of justice here, right? There's making right what has went wrong, but even deeper than that, what are we doing? We're establishing justice. And so the intention is not just to say I'm sorry. The intention of real justice is to not do the thing wrong to begin with. Again, it's in creating a more perfect union. And so we're establishing rules or laws in a way that people will see them, submit to them, and then they will go and live in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by those ideals. And so the concept of justice here is deeper than saying I'm sorry, right? We get a lot of that. Like, we want justice, right? We don't want people to be marginalized or hurt. And so the idea here, though, is that we want to create a culture in which we all can equally obtain. That's what we need to obtain life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So the concept of justice is not merely taking the things that are bad and making it right. The real, true concept of justice here is to do what is right. That is the goal. That's the high bar. Again, anyone here perfect? No, but it's the idea or the concept behind creating a more perfect union. And as we create a more perfect union, we're then able to establish a foundation of justice. If my heart is for you and your heart is for me to advance and to make my life better, to improve things, then I don't just look at the sins or the shortcomings in your life and tear you down, but I look at those areas as being places of weakness that we all have. And instead, I'm trying to bring justice into your life, which is a right way of living, a right way of thinking, and establish you, right? There's a difference in somebody who tears you down and somebody who builds you up. How many of you like the people that tear you down? Say, yes, please, I need more of that in my life. How would you rather be built up? This idea of justice is really critical to that. And so again, it's about we the people, not just as individuals, but a lifting up one of another. After established justice, it is to ensure domestic tranquility. That sounds very poetic. What does that mean? What is tranquility?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So we don't use that language often in our culture, do we? To be tranquil is to be at peace, to be even, right? When we talk about like a tranquil lake, you know, when you drive around Lake Crescent sometimes and you see just choppy, then you've driven around it and it's just like glass. That is tranquil, right? And so domestic, meaning not foreign, not outside of our walls, but within our walls. So domestic for you guys would be your household, or if you share the same room with someone, it'll be the harmony that you have, the peace that you have one with another. But it's to ensure it. It's to make sure that there is what? Peace. Now again, peace properly understood, tranquility properly understood, doesn't mean there can't be difficulty. Can't be like rubbing together, right? Trying to come at some things. Because again, the framers of the Constitution did not agree. They were much more like siblings than they were anything else. They fought for what they thought was right. But again, what was the goal? The goal was so that there was peace between one another, right? At times we fight because we want what we want. Have you ever made an argument with somebody because it was for their good? That's what we're talking about here. We want to debate and discuss for the group, the people. Ultimately, that's what peace is for. It's not just so, man, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with what they're dealing with. No, the goal here is to ensure, to do whatever it takes in the right way, right? With justice, establishing justice in a way that brings connection and tranquility and peace, even in our differences. Next, it says to provide for the common defense. What does that mean? Think of this in terms now again, using revolutionary language. There were how many states?
At what time?
For initial, how many states were there initially?
13.
13 states. 13 individual states that went up against one army from Great Britain, right? And so they're providing for the common defense. They all sent troops. This is where we have the modern day National Guard. There's not just a Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, but there's also each state has its own militia, the National Guard. the governor is responsible to send the National Guard to help. They're not controlled necessarily by
Sorry.
they're not controlled by the president, but those who are in the general armed services are. And so the goal then is not just the domestic, the inside tranquility, but to keep any outside invader at bay. And we do that, why? Because we understand that if I'm in this state way down here, and New York is getting attacked, this is a big part of revolutionary understanding. Why did they band together? Because they knew, I mean, Boston would be a little bit more accurate, right? Because the war started in Boston. What do people in Virginia know? That if Britain starts going after those wild men in Boston who are throwing all the tea into the ocean, what was likely to happen? Well, they were likely to attack Virginia just as easily. And so the states banding together to defeat a foreign entity that would try to dictate its will or mandate its will upon the people is really critical, right? It's like, it's kind of okay if you fight with your sibling, right? Like I can boss my sibling around, but if somebody else outside your family said the same thing, you'd be like, oh no, you didn't, right? There's a difference. We can get away with certain things at times, culturally, within our own households, but when that happens externally, there's kind of a different posture we take. Well, again, the idea is, and the goal is to get we the people together, so that as individual states, we see something that's happening outside of our state, that again, we consider that common defense. If somebody attacks California, the Washingtonians take note because they could attack just as easily here. And they're like a sibling. The next is to promote the general welfare. What does that mean?
Just welfare is kind of like a good way of living, right? Just kind of to have sure everyone lives well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's again getting back to this idea that we all should have the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The welfare is our people being taken care of, right? That we're not turning our backs on people, but we're considering that a healthy culture can only be healthy to the point that its weakest person is healthy. Right? We know that saying, right? You're only as strong as your weakest team player, whatever, right? If there is a cancer growing in your culture, you cannot ignore the cancer. There has to be something done to address it. And what we've done as a nation, sadly, is we've tried to cut people groups or thoughts out of, instead of trying to educate one another and debate and have a good understanding of how do we get back to a healthier spot. And so the general welfare means just that, is that we should all equally have laws applied to us. That if I have a law that I have to follow, you should have to follow it. And that those laws are created for the common good, for every person. It's meant to advance their life. And to secure, moving on, we have just a few minutes here, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. What does that mean? What is posterity?
That's what I was gonna ask.
Posterity is like learning something from someone older, right? Or gaining value for something in the
Yeah,
past.
it can be. And ultimately, Kayla would be my posterity. Why? She's my daughter, right? And so you guys, it's the next generation. This idea is not to just secure blessing for me, to try to get what I need to get to advance in a culture for myself. It's that I'm considering everything that I do, everything that I say, every law that we create here has an impact, not just immediately, but for you guys certainly. Right? We see the sin in our nation where we continue to expand the debt limit, meaning, well, we'll just take on more debt and take on more debt and take on more debt. What's the problem? Because eventually the bills come due, and I'm going to be long gone, when those bills come due, but you and your kids are going to be the ones holding the weight of the debt that is incurred. Right? The sins of the father are visited upon the next generations. The blessings of the father also are visited upon the next generation. And so, again, they're using this biblical language to say that the goal is not just about fixing the problem today, but having the foresight to see, if we make this decision today, how is it going to affect us 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now? Because it's easy to make a decision, right? How many of you ever bought something that you thought, man, this is really what I want, and then you spend all that money on it, and you get a little bit down the road and you go, why did I buy that? I wasted so much money on that. Right? We want the latest and greatest instead of disciplining ourselves to get something not quite as good. Well, again, that's not the foresight to see beyond things. We just got 5 more minutes here. And then it finishes, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It's a pretty short preamble, but it says a whole lot when we properly understand it. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish. They're making a proclamation here that goes beyond kind of just we're going to sign it, but this is a declarative statement. It is said with force. It is said with passion and conviction. It's said with authority. And where does this authority come from? From their understanding, it comes from the divine, the Creator. Why can the framers of the Constitution say this? Because they've been endowed to do so by their Creator. Why is that significant to you and I? Because we live in a culture currently. Well, let's take a vote. How many of you think, when you look at the culture of the United States today, that we could say, we the people, that we're together?
Not really.
How many of you think that, generally speaking, we're really trying hard to have a more perfect union, closeness together? How many of you think that we're trying to establish justice as a culture currently? How many of us do you think are ensuring domestic tranquility? Providing for the common defense. That one might be the closest out of the bunch. Promoting the general welfare. Not giving everyone welfare, but promoting it. How many of us are, culturally speaking, are we securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity? So we live in a season in American history, just 200 short years from when these documents were written. And we have fallen vastly short of the ideal. Why is history important? Because those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. And the reality is that you guys probably can't shift the entire culture of the United States. But the point of history is not always about shifting the entire culture. It's about shifting the culture in your own heart and your own mind. And so the object lesson for this week and is going to be this. As it pertains to your own life, and I want you to come kind of with a discussion as we start next week. As it pertains to my own life, how am I living out these ideals of the preamble? Whether it's with my siblings, with my parents, with the community, with friends. How am I living this out? In what ways is this applying to me today? Because I believe personally that if you were just to take this here, memorize it, begin to process it, and even open up your Bibles and say, well, all right, how does this apply here? You will be vastly ahead of the curve as far as culture building. In fact, I think if we were honest with ourselves and we think about the leadership in our midst, who God has ordained, right, to proclaim, much like the founders, and we look at ourselves as what, sons of God, who are submitted ultimately to the Father, but to the leadership that God has appointed for us, and that we look at our midst, and we look at the people in our midst, if we were to apply some of these principles, we might begin to generate culture in much deeper fashion. And so as you look at that, what I also want you to look at is not just the ways that you can do it, but I want you to look at maybe some areas that there are flaws in your life and be honest about it. It's okay, maybe this is an area where, man, I'm not living by that ideal. And again, I'm not promoting the Constitution as, right, it's not ultimately the foundation. There's things that undergird that, obviously. And the goal of always having self-reflection here, where we're missing it, is not to tear ourselves down, but it's so that we can be built up. That we can begin to understand the why. Why do we do things the way that we do? Because likely you have been influenced by culture itself. My generation has been influenced by the culture of my parents' generation. When you look at that historically, your parents' grew up in a time of tension, and it was kind of a season in our culture where there was a kind of countercultural against anyone in authority. So we pushed away the 60s and the 70s as your grandparents were kind of in the prime of their lives. That was the goal in American culture, to push back. We see that carry on through the 70s and 80s, my generation, even the 90s. Now you guys are left with all sorts of chaos. Congratulations, you win the prize. The second thing that I want you to look at and research upon your own is Article 1 of the Constitution. And that's it. I want you to read through it, write notes, write questions down, write thoughts down on it, because again, next week you're going to present kind of the preamble. What did I learn? How does this apply to my life? And then we're going to talk about Article 1. And ultimately, what I would like to see you guys do next week is have much more of a voice, because I felt like I talked a little bit too much today. And the goal is not me talking. I really don't want to be telling you guys things. I want you guys to engage in a way that you're teaching one another. And so I want you to come with some thoughts, some opinions. Strong opinions are welcome. And we might play a little bit of a game of debate. And I might intentionally put you on a side and sit across from the table and try to convince one another why your position is right and why their position is wrong. Any other thoughts as we close? I know Esther has a lot of deep things welling up inside of her she wants to share.
I don't think so.
Not so much. All right. Well, thank you guys for your time. I certainly appreciate
Thank you very much.
Thank
the
you.
attention to it.
You said Article 1 of the Constitution?
Article 1.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll get into all the fun stuff of legislative powers and begin to spell out what those look like.
Excellent.